On Press Perspective today, we revisit South Korea's tariff and investment agreement with the U.S. as the two allies seek to strengthen their ties. Do stay with us. Hello, welcome to Press Perspective for this Tuesday, November 4th, here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Today, trade ties between Seoul and Washington dominate our discussions, especially in light of last week's talks between President Lee Jae Myung and his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump in Gyeongju. For more, I have Thomas Maresca with American news agency UPI here in the studio. Thomas, welcome back.
Thanks, great to be here.
I also have Professor Oh Joon-seok at Sookmyung Women's University joining our session virtually. Professor Oh, the weather here in Seoul has gotten much colder. Hope you're doing well.
Yeah, it's autumn.
It is, Professor, it is. We'll start the discussion here in the studio. Thomas, let's begin with details of the trade deal between Seoul and Washington and the talks, of course, between the leaders last week in Gyeongju.
Yeah, sure. You almost said free trade, and I was going to say that's
did.
the opposite of what they had. But yeah, I mean, I think in general, South Korea sees this as a successful negotiation. Much of the framework had kind of been worked out already in July, but there were some details and sticking points, particularly with South Korea's investment that they agreed to into the U.S. But basically what ended up coming out of this deal, which was between Trump and Lee Jae Myung and the sideline of APEC, was these sort of so-called reciprocal tariffs that were 25% were reduced to 15%, as well as there were separate 25% tariffs on autos and auto parts. Those were also knocked down to 15%, which is important for South Korea because that's where Japan is, the main sort of auto export competitor. So Japan is at 15%. So that's a best case, I guess, scenario for South Korea. The main sticking point was this: South Korea had pledged $350 billion of investment into the U.S. 150 of that was going to be in shipbuilding cooperation. But then there was this kind of $200 billion in cash investments that was this nebulous sum, and there was a lot of concern on the South Korean side that this could really, practically empty out the foreign exchange reserves if it was demanded all at once. But they negotiated, cash payments on an annual basis capped out at $20 billion a year. So that, was sort of eases concern over draining these foreign exchange reserves. And South Korea also received assurances that the semiconductor industry will not be disadvantaged relative to Taiwan, another important, main competitor. And just a few other side things. South Korea was able to defend some of its agriculture sectors. That was a concern, like beef and rice being imported from the U.S. Agreed to buy some U.S. liquefied natural gas, and two sides talked about some increasing collaboration in some strategic science and technology areas. So I think overall, I think the professor can elaborate on this for sure, but I think the reaction for the most part has generally been seen as positive on the South Korean side from analysts and just sort of regular folks I talk to.
Right then, Professor Oh, first, what are your general thoughts about this trade deal between South Korea and the U.S.? And second, can you put into some tangible perspective the 15% tariff on South Korean goods entering the U.S. market? I mean, what does this mean for our exports to the U.S.?
Firstly, we were barely touched the bullet, and secondly, we could manage to keep access to the U.S. auto market. Both sides have played down the prospect of a breakthrough, disappointing many of electronics, chips, and auto industries. Both countries have historically been key allies, but tensions spiked after hundreds of Koreans were detained in an immigration raid in last month. President Lee managed to negotiate down to 15% after Seoul said it will invest, as Mr. Maresca commented, $350 billion US dollars in the US and buy $100 billion worth of liquefied natural gas. During the trip to Japan, Tokyo, the U.S. President signed an agreement on rare earth minerals, including the 15% tariff deal negotiated earlier this year. This is very important. What implies 15%? 15% of tariff will be added to the market price of cars in the United States, equally likely to Japanese cars. And then it will be the maximum range of affordability of relative competitiveness to rival Japanese cars. If 25% were levied, then those kind of competitiveness will be broken down. Korean companies need to invest in the U.S. To slide in the allied supply chain, but 100% of cash investment might be a disaster. Think about it. How could continue partnership when your big success comes from your partner's dismal disaster? I'll say this trade deal could be a restoration of a mutual respect based on co-prosperity between two key trade partner countries.
Professor Oh, as Thomas earlier said, the $350 billion US investment has been divided into 200 billion cash installments and 150 billion in shipbuilding and industrial cooperation. The cash installments, as Thomas mentioned earlier, face an annual cap of 20 billion to protect South Korea's foreign exchange market. Accordingly, the government here says the impact on the market will be minimal. Do you agree? And also, what are the gains for South Korea from such a hefty investment in the U.S.?
Yes, I do agree. Japanese case cannot be compared and applied to Korean case because Korean won is not a key currency, while Japanese yen is. When Japanese yen is a key currency, which is used for international settlement, among central banks around the world, they have Japanese yen reserves for preparation or for transaction. This might function as a reservoir in time of need, in time of uncertainty. Relatively speaking, Korean won is much more vulnerable to shock in the foreign exchange market because there is no reservoir outside of Korea. This is why currency swap contract is needed in advance of investment deal. A Korean economy made annual trade surplus of $40 billion US on average in total. In this respect, within range of annual cap of 20 billion US dollar from the perspective of durability of Korean forex market, it will be within range of safety. So the Korean forex market will not be contaminated that much. After concluding the deal, tariff reduction and access to the US market, there will be a direct US investment into Korea also made gains. These include foreign currency inflows that stabilize the Korean currency, enhance the industrial competitiveness, and an influx of capital and technology into Korea. Lots of efforts to attract foreign direct investment in key technology push Korean companies to innovate and move up the value chain. Korean multinationals has strategically aimed to attract foreign investment in key sectors like IT convergence, smart robotics, biotech, and renewable energies to drive future economic growth.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, Thomas, beyond trade, also following their bilateral talks last week, Mr. Trump shared support for South Korea's nuclear submarine ambition. Could you tell us a bit more about this support and what are the prospects of a future fleet of South Korean nuclear-powered submarines?
Yes, so this was a pretty big story that came out a little bit on the heels of the trade discussion. There wasn't much detail about it at the time, but then shortly after President Trump, basically, which he often does, announce something on social media, then there was a bit of, catching up afterwards to try and sort out exactly what the details are. And there's still, some, I think maybe a lot of parameters that are not exactly clear. But Trump basically said that he gave South Korea approval to build a nuclear-powered submarine. And, this is powered by nuclear fuel, not a submarine, carrying nuclear weapons. But this is a huge deal for South Korea. I mean, this is something that Seoul has wanted to do for quite a while. I mean, particularly within, say, probably the last decade or so. I mean, these nuclear power submarines can stay submerged much longer, have a much greater range, I think are quieter than these kind of diesel electric ones that they currently have. So, South Korea has had this as an ambition, particularly in the the context of North Korea's advancements in its own capabilities. I mean, North Korea tested submarine-launched ballistic missiles and has said that they're building a nuclear-powered submarine and sort of displayed it to the world earlier this year. You know, we don't know exactly to what extent that, you know, how far along they are with that. So, yeah, so this was not, you know, Lee Jae Myung had asked Trump for access to the fuel supply, which is a key element. You know, South Korea has been limited in the kind of nuclear fissile material that it can enrich, you know, to a certain percentage. But you know, this deal, as we understand it, would give not just, you know, it's not just permission, but it's sharing this sensitive technology, which the U.S. really has not done until very recently. I mean, Australia is the other example in recent years, where, you know, through AUKUS, where the U.S. agreed to you know, help you know, share the technology and help build nuclear-powered submarines. So, you know, this is really a big step forward within the alliance. And for North Korea, you know, I think it's a case where it plays into both countries' interests as they currently stand. I mean, on the one hand, from the U.S. perspective, they have been, you know, especially under this administration, have been pushing for allies to, you know, carry more of the burden, especially kind of in regional affairs, to, you know, for their own defense purposes, while at the same time, you know, trying perhaps in South Korea's case to involve them more in efforts not only focused on North Korea, but also in the greater region, perhaps keeping an eye on China. And these kind of subs would allow North Korea to, or South Korea to, you know, move through the Yellow Sea, the East Sea, you know, and sort of the wider Pacific region, and track Chinese and North Korean activity. And, you know, really also places South Korea on a level with only a handful of other countries. It's like US, China, Russia, Britain, France, India, and Australia are the only countries that have nuclear-powered submarines. And, you know, for South Korea, it also brings the South closer to this wartime operational control of its military, which has also been a big desire for the, you know, at least the last few administrations, and President Lee has also expressed this desire, and this gives South Korea, you know, a greater foothold in having the capacity to respond, you know, on its own, rather than having to wait for the U.S. to you know, control if anything were to happen. So, you know, it kind of overlaps both of their interests, and, you know, these submarines are apparently going to be built in the Philadelphia shipyard, which was bought by Hanwha recently, and that kind of also overlaps with this shipbuilding, you know, partnership between South Korea and the U.S. You know, all of that said, I think there still are questions. Hanwha, this shipyard, has not built naval vessels, has not worked with nuclear-powered vessels before, so there's going to obviously require some refitting of it. And I think, you know, the timeline is not tomorrow. Some defense, I think it was the Minister of Defense, or you have to cite exactly who it is. Yeah, I think Minister of Defense mentioned that, you know, it would take probably around 10 years, or, you know, mid 2030s to sort of see this out, and had said maybe there would be around 4 that would be necessary. I mean, but these are all kind of still to be determined. So, but that's, you know, where things stand at the moment.
Right, and keeping this in mind and speaking within your capacity as a scholar, Professor, what do you believe is the relationship between national security and economic cooperation? Also, do you believe this particular relationship has become perhaps more pronounced in recent times?
I've been long in the public sector of international trade, so I do know the importance of the strategic partnership between Korea and the United States. But as a scholar following terminology of U.S. Trade Act, they say themselves, PNTL, permanent normal trade relationship, should be based on trust between trade partners. I don't want to quote Kraljic matrix, which stresses the importance of managing bottleneck item as well as a strategic item in time of sudden supply disruption, raising issue of threatening national security by weaponizing of economic tools. When I learned in the States as a student, as if it were other countries' case, far from U.S. view, countries can use economic policy like a tariff or sanction as a form of weaponized leverage to achieve a political or strategic goal, potentially destabilizing the economic order, which generate a yield effect against the global economy. That relationship between national security and economic cooperation is changing globally as the rules of global order shift. Economic cooperation can enhance national security through interdependence and shared prosperity, but it can also pose risks if economic dependence becomes security vulnerabilities, over-reliance on another nation for a critical goods technology or a supply chain can create a vulnerability that can be exploited during time of tension. The fact is, both cooperation and competitions are used as tools while trade can foster stability, countries' economic strengths can be used to build its military power, and economic tools like a tariff can be used for political leverage. What is needed at this moment is global leadership of prosperity and not U.S.-only leadership.
Right. Meanwhile, Thomas, staying with nuclear-related developments, Mr. Trump has called on the U.S. to restart nuclear weapons testing. What's the latest on that front?
Right, so this was another kind of surprise that was announced via, President Trump's social media platform. And it came pretty much right before his meeting with President Xi Jinping of China on October 29th. And basically it was just, he tweeted out or said on social media that, that the U.S. would immediately restart nuclear weapons testing. Basically saying that, it was in response to China and Russia also doing such things, which, kind of drew a surprised response. I mean, as far as everyone knows, China and Russia haven't tested a nuclear weapon per se, and, I don't know since when exactly. But, this would end the moratorium, the U.S. moratorium that was announced in 1992. So, and then there was, again, a kind of figuring out what was meant fallout a bit afterwards. And, Trump on Sunday was on, interview news program, and basically was saying that Russia was testing, China was testing, they're doing these secret nuclear tests, and, was basically saying that it was necessary to keep up with these rival nations. But at the same time, the Energy Secretary in the U.S., Chris Wright, who would be the one, that's the department that would oversee such tests, was saying that the initial testing would be non-critical, he called it, which is not involving, explosive nuclear detonation. So not expecting to see, a mushroom cloud in the desert in Nevada or something. It was basically talking about doing component system tests for advanced, next generation technology. No confirmed timeline for any of this. And I think, basically what they are responding to is, Russia in particular has held trials of some of its advanced nuclear capable systems, including a Poseidon underwater drone, but these were not, testing nuclear warheads. And obviously North Korea is in the picture as well as really being the country that has been, most recently has tested nuclear weapons. So, it seems, on the one hand, is it leverage, bluster, but on the other hand, it does sort of fit into some of the priorities that this current administration and the Defense Department has discussed as far as modernizing its weapon systems and keeping up with China. Obviously it's also alarms arms control experts. There are just worries about undermining this kind of global moratorium, triggering a new arms race. The Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, putting the credibility of those at risk by participating. I mean, it's hard to condemn North Korea for doing nuclear tests if you yourself are doing it, I suppose. I think obviously for allies too, there's some concern and it could destabilize. But again, it's sort of a lot of words at this point that, it's hard to know exactly where it's going to lead.
Right. But Professor, despite these latest developments, that is, on the international security front, the South Korean stock market has been rallying in recent days. How do you explain the stellar stock market performance here in the country?
Simply speaking, the stellar performance of Korean stock market is primarily explained by the AI-driven semiconductor boom. Korean multinationals like Samsung Electronics, SK Hynix, which accounts for a large portion of cost index, are central to the global AI supply chain. Strong earnings reports and a semiconductor super cycle have driven their stock price to a record high, pulling the entire markets up. The rally has extended to other key industries. As time goes, strong performance has been observed in defense and shipbuilding, automobile and batteries, which driven by stable export channels and demand for energy storage solutions. Foreign investors, previously net sellers, have poured capital back into the market, purchasing trillions of won worth of stocks. Could assign into the capital market. This inflow is driven by the attractive relative undervalued market expectations for continued growth in tech sector. A reduction in trade conflicts fears between the United States and China has provided relief to Korea's export-dependent economy, further boosting market sentiment. In this sense, this kind of stellar performance will be continued.
Right. And the stock market back on Monday surpassed the 4,200 mark for the first time, Thomas. Moving forward, Thomas, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is here for annual security talks. What has been shared about these particular talks?
Right. So Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, or as he calls himself, Secretary of War, on Monday visited the DMZ and the border truce village of Panmunjom alongside South Korea and his South Korean counterpart, An-gyubak. And, basically, they had their annual security talk, the Security Consultative meeting on Tuesday. And pretty much what we know was from a press conference they held afterwards. And, I think just in a bigger picture, it's a show of, I think there's, from the South Korean side, glad to see that the defense secretary was here, and a show of sort of support for the alliance, and on the heels of this relatively successful, I think, APEC summit as well. So that's a positive sign. You might remember a few months earlier, Hegseth actually skipped South Korea on his trip through Asia. I think during this period of this transition between administrations and concern that things were not under control here, or we're not ready. So, it's good, I think, on that regard. But basically, he discussed, they said they're going to release a communique to lay out more what they discussed. But, Hegseth said that North Korea, Seoul will remain focused on deterring North Korea as its main objective, but there has been discussions, that have been floating around in the last, under this administration, basically, suggesting that maybe the U.S. troops stationed in South Korea might be used, more looking towards regional conflicts, including, maybe something between China and Taiwan. And Hegseth didn't really, said that, protecting against nuclear armed North Korea is the main goal, but, mentioned there's no doubt that flexibility for regional contingency is something we would look at. So that's in the works. And, clearly there was some discussions about things like defense costs and other issues. And, Washington has been, has wanted, the Trump administration in particular has wanted Seoul to share a greater portion of the cost sharing agreement. So that may be, something we're going to see come out. Although I think South Korea, he said South Korea has been a model ally. He mentioned Trump allowing the nuclear subs to be built, and said, we want to ensure that they have the best capabilities in their own defense. We want our allies to be strong. So, I think South Korea has probably done as much as could be expected to sort of meet the demands of this administration. And, Seoul does have a relatively higher share of defense spending compared to a lot of its, NATO and even Japan, other sort of cohorts. So that's, more or less, I think we'll see more coming forward, but that was the highlight of what they talked about.
You're right. I suppose the phrases defense modernization or alliance modernization and strategic flexibility are phrases we'll continue to see in the near future. All right, Thomas, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today.
Thank you.
And Professor Oh, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you for having me.
Right, well, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching.